29th. With me, I'm Councilmember Horton. With me today are Councilmember Falcone and Councilmember Schneider. Today, we're going to have a continuing review of the fiscal year 2009 recommended budget and departmental adjustments. In addition, we're going to look at the multi-year general fund forecast. So I think at this point, we'll turn it over to Mr. Pearson and let you walk us through it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Pearson, Finance Director. And Mr. Chair, just to kind of reiterate a little more background on what you just said is our agenda for today. We're going to pick up where we left off last week when we ran out of time, and we're going to go over with you some of the changes to the recommended budget, changes from the originally adopted second year of the two-year financial plan, and show you some of the details of how we got from what was in the second year of the two-year financial plan to what's before you now as the recommended fiscal year 2009 budget. There'll also be a chance on one of these schedules to look at how the recommended 09 budget compares to the adopted current year budget, because I think it's important to point out that we focus on the fact that some adjustments have been required to the second year of the two-year financial plan, and it's natural for people to equate that with cuts because there have been reductions in portions of the recommended budget compared to what was in the second year of the two-year financial plan. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that the fiscal year 09 recommended budget is still larger than the current fiscal year budget, and so when we're talking about cuts, we're talking about reductions from what was in the second year of the two-year plan, not reductions from the current level of expenditures. And I really think that that's important to keep in mind. Next year's budget is proposed to grow less quickly than it would have otherwise grown, but it's still growing. And that's true of virtually every single department in the general fund.
There was a good letter from Mr. Armstrong, the city administrator, in the paper on Sunday on this topic, and it really points out that what we're talking about is the rate of growth is slower than we had projected, and I think people need to understand that. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Well, thank you.
Anyway, proceed.
Thank you. I'm going to turn in a moment over to Jill Tora, our budget manager, who is going to take you through some of the various adjustments to the second year of the two-year plan. And we were kidding on the way over here that it's trying to break the numbers out as we have done on the schedule that you have before you is a little like trying to unscramble an egg. You get from one point to the other, and then to go back 6 weeks later and try to break those components out 6 months later is a bit of a challenge, but I think that it's important, and I think that it does highlight that some of the adjustments are not as dramatic as they might at first blush seem, because the numbers appear maybe to be a little larger, but after you break them out into the components, as Joe will explain, some of the reduction, the slowing of growth, was a natural trend caused by reforecasting of our payroll with more accurate position updates and salary and benefit numbers and all of those good things. And so it really does, I think, highlight that the sort of discretionary recommended changes are less dramatic than they might otherwise at first blush seem. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jill, and she'll take you through the schedule.
All right. Ms. Tara, please proceed.
Good afternoon. The summary of appropriations starts on B9 in the recommended budget document, and it starts with the two-year plan, the numbers that are contained in the two-year plan for the second year of the plan, fiscal year 09. And then it details a column of the approved adjustments to date, which are the supplemental appropriation requests of an ongoing nature that Council has approved during the fiscal year. The only two of those would be the impact of the fire MOU that was approved once fiscal year 08 started and the two-year plan was already produced. The impact of that was about $421,000. And the only other thing is an item that came to you recently to Council, which is the police animal control storage fees, which are fees that we pay to the county, and those are going up, being ratcheted up over the next 3 years. The impact of that on 09 is $158,000.
Can we clarify that for the public? That's the pound.
That's the pound, yes,
That's
it
the
is.
city, the animals that are picked up in the city and taken to the county pound.
Correct.
That's
and we
our
pay-
share of it.
Yes.
Thanks.
And then the next column is labeled mid-cycle adjustments, and that's a bit like the scrambled eggs that Mr. Pearson referred to. There are a number of different things going on in that column, and what I'd like to do today is to drill down into that column to give you a better understanding of what makes up those numbers, because you're looking at the contingency adjustments, and the numbers of the contingency adjustments that you've seen to general fund departments is really different than the number you're looking at in that mid-cycle adjustment. So let's go through that in a little bit more detail. I'd like to point you to the single sheet that I passed out. The first thing we do when we initialize a budget development cycle is that we reinitialize the budget system and then take a picture of the current payroll as it is now in the live payroll system, and we reforecast costs based on that. So that takes into account employee turnover, position changes, reallocations of staff between programs. We also update MOU assumptions each year for those MOUs that are expiring, and we make assumptions about what may be negotiated, what's a reasonable MOU estimate for the following years. We did have a change on that this year. We also update for new PERS rates for the new medical premiums, which 2 of the increases hit in any given fiscal year because the medical increases hit on January 1st of each year. And then we update the allocated costs from the ICS funds, and then there are other small technical adjustments that we make to some of the numbers, what we call status quo adjustments. So if we look at this single...
Just one comment before you go ahead, Jill. The ICS, there shouldn't be ever much change there, right? Because those are already approved.
Right.
We've already looked at those in the past.
What we do is we enter them for both years of the 2-year cycle at the beginning when we're developing the 2-year plan, and we make assumptions in growth for those. But particularly with retiree medical, we update those for the payments made for the current retiree medicals receivers each year, as well as we update vehicle maintenance and replacement charges for turnover in the fleet, because the fleet is replaced annually, and we do that sort of a or not on a pay-as-you-go, but you pay in based on your current fleet.
One of the adjustments in PD, for example, is that the fleet would be replaced less frequently.
Yes.
So would that be reflected here then?
No, not in this column. This is just where we start, sort of developing the budget that we kick off for departments before they make any proposed changes to update for changes to the second year of the plan and before any contingency adjustments. So this is what finance is busy crunching numbers in November and early December. Okay.
If I might, I wanted to, and tell me, Jill, if you probably did plan to get to this, but just to stress that if you look at the first 2 numbers up there under item number 1, the salary and benefit changes being reduced by $910,000, that simply is a reflection of the fact, I think it's just important to say that does not reflect any staffing changes in terms of number of positions. It's just turnover and reforecasting. If we had done nothing, if we had still had a balanced budget, we would have recognized and realized these savings automatically. So this does not represent any management decision-making. It's simply reforecasting based on more accurate data that we have in January or December of this last year than we had a year previous. So it's just, it doesn't, I don't want anyone to think that this represents changes in position allocations or number of positions or reductions in those things. So.
Thank you, Bob. So as Mr. Pearson indicated, that staff turnover, we can have up to a 20% difference in salary and benefits for staff turnover. Generally, the staff that leave are at step 5, and we hire in, or if it's still vacant when we forecast, it'll forecast at step 1, and that's a 20% savings, which you can see up to, $30,000 to $40,000 per position.
20% salary only.
20% salary only.
So based on that, and this number here, which is almost $1 million, in, as Mr. Pearson said, just adjustments, normal adjustments, it can then be extrapolated that the salary in total for the city organization, the amount the city organization spends in salaries and benefits, is a total of, is that, if this is 20%, I'm not saying it is 20%, but what is the amount, if you have that off the top of your head?
The kickoff salaries were about $52 million for the general fund.
Salaries?
Yes.
Not counting benefits?
Yeah.
And that's closer to 75 million probably, just in rough terms.
So that in total, salaries and benefits for the city approximates, just in the general fund, approximates $75 million. Okay, just to put this number, which is large, it's almost $1 million, in context. Thanks.
Correct.
And in that context, it's a little over 1%. Yeah.
And just to give you a better feel for that, the staff turnover that we see is roughly about 0.5% is every year when we reforecast. And then there are other changes. People, throughout the current fiscal year, people will have moved funds or programs. And then there's also some reclassifications that will be in there where they've, changed. So that's what makes up the 910,000. If you look at item number 2, the updated MOU assumptions, in the original 2-year plan, the units that have an expiring MOU during the term of the 2-year plan are the general, TAP, supervisors, and manager units. And originally we had a 4.5% salary increase assumed in the 2-year plan. We lowered that when we kicked off the budget cycle to 4% in the out years for those units. That realized about $136,000 worth of savings. Number 3, which I'm sorry my numbering's off on this handout, are the new PERS rates. And we saw an increase in the PERS rates, although modest. Police was up 1.39%. Fire was up 0.82%, and all other employees, the PERS rate was up 0.9% over the original PERS estimates that they gave us for FY09. That resulted in an extra cost of about $460,000, and again, this is general fund only. We saw some good news on the medical premiums that are paid by the city. The 2-year plan had assumed a 15% increase on 1108, as well as an additional 15% increase in 1109, both of which hit fiscal year 09. And the actual rates came in this year at about a 7% increase. Yeah, so that was a very nice surprise, and therefore we changed our assumption for next January down to 10%. And the savings of that was roughly about $200,000 in the medical. Then we had some small adjustments to allocated costs, as I was mentioning before, to the retiree medical, the vehicle maintenance, and vehicle replacement rates, and then a couple of other technical adjustments, so that the total reprojection, just when we reinitialize the budget system and prepare that baseline status quo budget, is a savings of about $771,000. And again, I wanted to stress that these are ordinary and normal adjustments that are made to the budget numbers each year. So we see this as a normal cycle. I'd like you to go over to the detailed sheet, and I wanted to show you what kind of impact this can have on some of the departments, just specifically. In finance, if you look, it's at the bottom of the first page, the revenue, cash management, the cashiering, collections, and the license and permits. And again, we're in this mid-cycle reprojection adjustments column. You look at the cashiering collections and you say, my goodness, the salaries or that program went down almost $90,000. What happened? Well, what they did.
Hang on for a second, Jill. Do you have an extra copy of that?
I do.
You might want to.
Okay.
Thanks.
What the staff did there was they reallocated the staff from the cashiering and collections program within that division. So some of it went to the revenue and cash management program, some of it went to the license and permits program, And the net of those three is about a $25,000 savings, and that corresponds to the vacancy of the current Treasury Manager position, reforecast vacant at a step 1. So you've got all sorts of details like this that when you unravel them, you know, they start to make sense when in aggregate you look at the number and you think, wow, what's going on? Another good example is in the BEAT coordinator and DARE program on page 3. It's about halfway down the police department. There's a $90,763,000 savings in that program, and that looks a lot. That looks like about a position cut. What happened in that program was they had turnover of 2 police officers that went from step 5 to step 1, and an ordinary savings from a police officer at step 5 forecast with full family medical benefits down to a step 1 with employee only would be about $48,000 just for the savings associated with 1 police officer. Another thing that's going on in the police department with that patrol division number, you'll see just a few lines down that went down about
Another
300.
question, Jill.
That went down about $306,000, and most of that in there was turnover, employee turnover. But what happened was during the fiscal year, the current fiscal year, they reclassified a police officer and moved it up to the chief staff program, and you see the corresponding increase in the police admin program.
That's the information services, the CIO,
Yes,
PIO, basically.
PIO.
The person who talks to the press.
Yes.
Right, moved it under the chief as opposed to patrol.
Yes.
Correct, okay.
So as long as we're on that, policy would be that positions will drop to step 1 unless justified and approved by the city administrator.
Correct. We ordinarily hire at step 1, although certain times in recruitments, positions will be hired at a higher step depending on the qualifications and experience of a given applicant. But if positions are vacant, we forecast them at step 1 with the benefit package of employee plus 1.
Good, thank you.
I'd like to move over to the second column, which is department requests. And again, we're drilling down on this total mid-cycle adjustments number, lump sum number that's in the budget document. And the department request budget represents, these are the adjustments that the departments would have submitted beyond these normal reforecast adjustments to take into account adjustments for changes since the 2-year plan was adopted. It includes new funding requirements, new services, and other miscellaneous adjustments that they do. And I'd just like to point out a few so you could see, you know, a little bit more detail on them. If you just look at administrative services on the first page, you see that the department request for the city clerk program is up $10,000, and that was an additional $10,000 that was included in the recommended budget for a new campaign filing statement software online. The human resources budget, you see that goes up $36,140. That is funding for the City Leadership Academy. And they've run that program this year with no funding and determined that it's going to cost about $36,000. So we added that to their budget. If we go down to community development, you see a big number of changes in their program, totaling about $80,000. And what they did there was they created a new program called the Hearing Officer Environmental Review and Training Program, and they reallocated staff and appropriations from other programs in their department. The other thing they did was they reallocated some positions from other funds over to the general fund. So those are the types of adjustments for that department. We can go over to fire, and you see in fire.
Chair,
Question,
Jill?
Jill.
Could you just explain what the $99,000 is in code in zoning enforcement?
I believe that was for a position that was originally included in the 2-year plan that should have been deleted. So that was a
Okay,
technical
so
adjustment.
the level of code enforcement that we're doing
Is not
is not
changed.
going to change.
Not due to a mid-cycle reprojection adjustment.
that sort of baits the question as to, okay, well, then what is changing about it? People are very concerned with code enforcement. Our city attorney's concerned with code enforcement. So when you see a big number like this, I think it's important to understand it. And if it's not a staffing change, then, or because it's been vacant and should have been deleted, so it's.
Yes,
but,
and
but then it baits the question, well, what is going to change?
And
The
I
way
know
you
that
phrased it.
they did not delete any code enforcement officers. This was a clerical position and some other reforecast adjustments. I know that on their contingency adjustments, there were no changes to the code enforcement program.
Yeah, but the way you phrased it was, code enforcement is not going to change based on a mid-cycle adjustment, but that leads one to believe that code enforcement will change, just not based on this. Is that true or not?
I can verify that with the department, but when I look over at the proposed contingency adjustments, there are none in that program, which tells me that they haven't changed the level of service. They've just reallocated within their department.
Yeah. You're going to turn it on.
You have to turn the little box on there. Up top, there's a button. You push it all the way. There you go.
Why don't you introduce yourself?
Michelle DeCant with Community Development. The way I understand it, under the mid-cycle reprojection adjustments, that $99,000, according to what Joe Torra had just said, was a correction of something that was in our budget. We haven't reduced a position in that, and we don't expect to be reducing any type of zoning enforcement activity that we're doing at this point. Then when you go to the next column of the department requests, as Joe was saying, there's just the different adjustments for our new program, where we've taken some staff and allocated them to the new SET program, the Staff Hearing Officer Environmental and Training. And then when you come to our contingency adjustments, there's nothing that we've proposed from those programs for contingency to reduce anything in the zoning enforcement program.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle. If you look on page 2 at the fire administration program, I just wanted to point out, you see that goes up roughly $40,000 in administration. That adjustment is for custodial at the new temporary building where all the administrative offices are located during the Fire Station 1 seismic retrofit. Another interesting one to look at is the total for the Parks and Rec department. The department, and that's the subtotals on page 3. Their department request budget is roughly $194,000 more than their mid-cycle reprojection. And that has to do with they have changed their programs and services, offered new services, reallocated money within their department, and that additional funding request is supported by new user fees primarily in their department. The last one I wanted to go through was the police department request budget, and that one is a reduction of $133,000, which represents the impact of adjustments for the parking violation revenue that has not come in as planned. Each department is given a status quo budget under the revenue target method, and so they balance to a level of subsidy that we give them, their departmental revenues less their expenditures. And so for the 2-year plan, they had significantly increased parking violation revenues, and with a corresponding increase in appropriations. This is just to bring it in line with the actual revenues. The parking violation revenues next year have been reduced $300,000, and they only came up with roughly $100,000, and that was primarily cutting a clerical position in the, I think, community services division. No, it would have been in support services, and then some other minor adjustments to supplies and services. Okay. So that's the department request column. And then the next column is the proposed contingency adjustments. And these adjustments, departments are going through in detail as at the budget public hearings with the full council. One thing to note
So that's our code name for possible budget reductions due to forces beyond our control.
correct for the revised revenue estimates. And you'll notice at the bottom, the total of that column is down roughly $690,000 for the general fund. And that doesn't correspond to the number, this $2.3 million that you've seen on the list of adjustments recommended for implementation. This number represents roughly about $1.4 million in expenditure adjustments to general fund department budgets, and then is offset by the $710,000 increase to the appropriated reserve that we put in there. The balance of the $2.3 million in adjustments recommended for implementation are revenue increases, and those are about $915,000.
Question, Ms. McKinney?
Well, when you get to that $689,000 number and you add all the departments together, it's the police department, for instance, is $571,000 in the aggregate between mid-cycle and department requests, and then probably a bit more, $500,000 missing, or there's $50,000 missing here somewhere, I think. Anyway, there's a number here under non-departmental community promotions, general government, that's $710,000. Could you go into a little bit of detail on that? Because that really offsets what otherwise would be fairly substantial cuts, monies moving in for various reasons. And what is this $710,000, and specifically community promotions, general government?
Sure.
Somebody's asking for a lot more money.
As Mr. Pearson mentioned in the beginning, you know, the budget, the recommended budget for '09 is roughly about $4.5 million more on the appropriation side over the current year budget. So, but certainly less than what was in the 2-year plan. This $710,000 offsets what would be $1.4 million in expenditure reductions to departmental budgets over what was contained in the 2-year plan. The $710,000 is the additional money that we programmed into the general fund appropriated reserve because there are some other big contingencies out there that we could face next year. And it's a way for us to have to be able to deal with it without dipping into reserves once the budget is adopted or going back and asking departments to make additional cuts.
So just to simplify that, appropriated reserves, this is money that we, on our own, Mr. Armstrong on his own, takes from our general fund reserves, puts into the budget so that we have a cushion for future bad things.
Mr. Armstrong, I sense a comment coming on.
Well, it's not taken from reserves.
Okay, can you
Let me I guess start
explain
the more
this for us a
basic
little
way,
bit?
and that is
Yeah.
when we looked at next year's budget, we believed that we would be out of balance, and so we asked the departments to give us a set of adjustments, revenues and expenditures, and the total of those adjustments was well in excess of what we needed to balance the budget. And then when we sat down with the departments and we went through all of those adjustments, we decided to actually make about $800,000 more in adjustments than we needed to make to balance the budget, because we expect that what's going on at the state with especially Prop 172 funds, with the COPS funding, and a couple other things may create some additional adjustments we need to make midsummer. And so we were basically trying to provide the council a cushion to deal with those rather than have an unbalanced budget.
Okay.
And
So this is a cushion. However, it does not come from reserves. It comes from pro rata, if you will,
Basically
or some
from
way.
revenues
From
that will
all
come
the
in.
different departments have chipped in
Right.
out of their budgets to create this cushion against future bad things.
Right.
It's
And-
not from reserves.
Right.
I'm just trying to make it clear.
And this was a joint decision by all the department heads when we looked there and we said, you know what, we've gone through all this work to identify these adjustments. We don't want to have to go back in and do more of this in the midsummer cycle, and we don't think the councils want to do it. Let's give them a little cushion here. It's only 1 year. It's not ongoing, to deal with issues that we believe are going to come up. And we think realistically $600,000-700,000 is a good cushion to cover ourselves and not have to go back into it after the state does their budget.
Could that be things like keeping a position vacant another couple of months or something?
Well, in this case, it's already been identified as adjustments to the departments. We also, because about half of these adjustments that we're proposing are one-time adjustments, we will be selectively keeping positions vacant that are approved in this budget until we have a better feel for fiscal year 2010 and 11, because unless the economy comes back at a rate greater than we expect, we're going to have to make additional adjustments in the following two-year financial plan.
Great, thank you.
So that concludes my unraveling or unscrambling of the egg. And if you had any other questions, I'd be happy to answer. But I hope this has provided a little bit more insight into what makes up that large number in the budget document.
Mr. Chair, with
Pearson.
I would just sort of like to add some comments to that, and that is that the three columns you see on the schedule that are inside the box, really those add up to, and this may be stating the obvious, but maybe for people that haven't seen this before, those three columns inside the box add up to the column just to the right of the box, the $1,239,206 at the bottom of the general fund, and that then ties forward to the other schedules in the budget document, right? Exactly, that column that's in that we started that Ms. Torres started with. So those three things do add up to that. And again, I just want to point out, if you look at well, let's take Public Works because they're at the very bottom of the schedule. Their current year adopted budget, $6.8 million. The budget recommended for next year's $7 million. So up a couple $100,000. Parks and Rec also, up from 14.8 to 15.3. Police, as we said before, up $500,000. So as Ms. Torres mentioned, overall, you can see that the general fund budget is still expected to grow from about $103.4 million to 107.8. So clearly it's not a reduction. It's as correct as the chair pointed out. It's a reduction in the rate.
That's a concept that people running their home budgets don't often think of, so it's good to make it clear, I think.
Suggestion, especially for the departments when they give their presentation to the full council, especially under police, and I think, well, the ones where a lot of them where the administration cost looks like it's gone up, to explain why, because it sounds like it makes it a top-heavy organization when that's not necessarily the case. For example, in the police department, it's because the PIO position just moved under the chief's division versus patrol position. And I think there was another explanation in another department. But I know when we had our first full council budget hearing, that was looked at and saying, well, how can we be cutting one thing and adding on to admin of all things? So just to explain that a little more, or ask the department heads when they come to do that to put that in there, I think just to clarify would be helpful.
Very good. I'll be sure and communicate that with departments.
Is this same presentation going to be given to the full council?
No, we had not planned on that.
So the council won't be seeing the three columns here?
No.
Okay. Mr. Pearson.
Very good. Well, thank you. The other two topics that we wanted to cover today are the general fund revenues and a look at the general fund's multi-year forecast. And I do know that you all three are well aware of the fact that this committee in particular, and even the full council this time around, have had pretty extensive looks at both of those topics, starting back in the work session in January, and then as part of the initial budget presentation on the filing date of April 15th. So I don't think that I need to spend a whole lot of time on it, but I did want to just maybe take 5 or 6 minutes to reiterate a couple points that that I think are worth remembering. And again,
Bob.
Oh, yeah. The schedule I've handed out is simply a recap of the projected growth rates for some of our key revenues. And again, this schedule was presented pretty much as is back at the January work session. And I'm not going to go through it in detail. Just to point out, if you look at the block on the right, the fiscal year 09, you can see that just the two columns, the percentage columns, the budgeted growth, and then further to the right, the estimated growth. You can see that sales tax, we lowered our growth rate from 3.5% to 1%. Bed tax, transient occupancy tax, 5% to 3%, property tax, 6% to 5%, and the utility users tax, we left the same at 3%. So we did, as you know, have to do that, and this was the genesis of the issue that caused us to require some adjustments, because as you can see at the bottom right-hand corner of this table, we had to lower our revenue estimates just on a non-departmental revenue estimates of about $2.8 million. When you add into that the parking citation revenue and the building and safety revenue from community development that are running well behind the estimates for this year, that's another $500,000. That brought it to about $3.3 million. So
an interesting number in the news this morning. There was a summary of impact of housing values dropping, and many cities in the United States are experiencing drops of anywhere between 18 and 25%. So to see our evaluations, essentially, which is what this is, staying relatively constant is encouraging.
I certainly agree. And the one thing, I do have some new news, and that's what we're going to look at now. I just handed out. And this is transient occupancy tax, our bed tax, or TOT. And this has our revenue through 9 months of the fiscal year, through March. And you can see that if you look at the sort of the history of this fiscal year down that far right-hand corner, you can see that really for the early part of the year through the summer, we were in the 1 to 3.5% growth range. And then we had 2 consecutive monthly declines in November and December. And then since January, we've been back growing again. But the 2 most recent months, February was up fairly strongly at 7%, but March, 4.7%. So year to date, through 9 months, 3/4 of the fiscal year, we're up 2.7%. And we're projecting for this fiscal year that we would be, our revised estimate was that we would finish the year with 2% growth. So we are slightly ahead of that, and with April, May, and June being larger bed tax months, we're hopeful that if that trend continues, we might even see that 2.7% grow slightly up to maybe 3%, which would obviously take a little of the pressure off next year in terms of making budget.
Okay.
I do want to caution you, because I happened to talk to the CBB yesterday, that Easter was early this year in March, and they said that April is not doing that well, and so the March figure shows Easter being there, and so there probably is not going to have that kind of growth rate going forward, unfortunately.
Do we know what accounted for the big 7% increase in February? I mean, I know the film festival was that time, but that really was part of the uptick, or do we know?
No, we don't know really.
Okay.
I mean,
that's pretty tremendous to go from a negative to just 2.1 and then bounce up to 7 in the winter, to do that, which is fabulous. Okay.
The only thing I would point out is that the prior year we were up in that month year over year 2.6%, which is a kind of a lower target, if you will. Whereas if you look at March last year, we were up 11.5%, so that was a little bit more of a difficult hurdle to reach. So, but the answer, truthfully, is no. I don't know.
Well, a little bit just further on that sort of a subject. If you look at it, we have the numbers here from 2005 through 2008, and if you go across the lines, there's very little consistency with respect to what months mean good and what months mean bad. I mean, the February, if you go from 05 on, it's minus 0.6, 5.6, 2.6, and now 7. But then again, if you go to a September from 2005, it's 5%, 19.1%, 7.9%, and 1.9%. So, it's all over the board on every month, and you'd think that the summers would be a little more consistent across the board, but You take June, and it's 18.9%, 5.7%, 2.1%, and we don't have the numbers for this year, quite obviously, because it's not July yet. So we don't know what June '08 is going to be. So it's kind of haphazard, to say the very least. And I think that's worth at least noting, not that what is happening at the state isn't very, very real, and we should be very, very cautious about that. But I just thought I'd mention that because unlike the one we're going to see now, which is utility user tax, which has a little more consistency because, you know, people use energy at a relatively consistent rate, although we'd like them to use less of it, which will, of course, impact our revenues, but we'd still like them to use less of it. TOT is a little hard to get your arms around.
It is indeed. Councilmember Falcone gave me a nice segue into our next slide, which is utility users tax. Thank you. And you may recall that we are actually projecting this year to end this year with 3% growth in utility tax, and you can see that through 9 months, 3/4 of the fiscal year, we're approaching that. We're at 2.8%. You can tell, I'm sure, by looking at the growth rate that we enjoyed during March, that went a long way to moving us towards our 3% goal for the year. But again, we're projecting 3% next year, but it does appear that, you know, another major revenue source here with our utility tax is in line with our current year projections. And one of the hardest things for us to deal with is when we don't make our current year projection, that has a compounding effect on our ability to make our budget for the next year. And we've seen that, in fact, this fiscal year, '08, where we might have budgeted a fairly reasonable 3 or 4% growth in a particular revenue, but because we didn't make the revenue estimate last year, we needed to grow 5 or 6 or 7% to make budget, which was not realistic, and so it really has that hangover effect that carries into the next year. So it's really hard to overstress the importance of having realistic projections for our current year upon which we base next year's revenue projections. The other two big revenue sources are sales tax and property tax, and I will only say I don't have schedules to hand out on them because, as you know, they don't come in sort of nice and evenly through the year, month by month, as the other ones do. With sales tax, we get meaningful numbers updated once a quarter, and that's a quarter in arrears, as you all well know. And with property tax, really until the dust settles in July, we won't know exactly where we're going to end the year. I have no doubt we're going to make budget. The question is, as always, on the supplemental property tax, what that'll come in at and whether that will push us up even a little bit more over budget. But it's just really, it's hard to tell at this point. We're basically projecting zero growth in sales tax for the rest of this fiscal year. I'm going to finish up just quickly by one quick look, I promise, at our multi-year forecast for the general fund. And again, I want to focus on the recommended budget, which is fiscal year '09, and it's in a green column, the second green column, the middle green column. And then I want to take a quick look at just a couple numbers in the column to the right of that, the fiscal year 2010 projected. But if you take the fiscal year, and I'm grateful that you have all seen this enough times that you know how to read this, if you just take that fiscal year '09 recommended column and go down almost 3/4 of the way, or maybe even a little more, you'll see in bold net increase/decrease total reserves, and you follow that over to fiscal year '09 and you see it's zero, which means that the budget is balanced, as we know, including capital. All of the current operating expenses and capital for next year are proposed to be paid for from current revenues, no reserves, and that includes a capital program of almost $1.4 million. If you just go up a few more rows, you'll see appropriated reserves, and that's $815,000, and that's the number that Councilmember Falcone was referring to earlier in the meeting. We normally now budget about $100,000 to $125,000 for an appropriated reserve as a built-in cushion into the budget, but as we discussed earlier in this meeting, we've increased that. The last thing I want to point out is if you look at the net increase decrease total reserve number again, which you start in 09 is a 0, and if you look just to the right of that, you'll see a negative 2,287,648, and that would be for fiscal year 2010, which is the first year of the next 2-year financial plan. The 2-year plan you will be considering a year from right now. And you can see that, as Mr. Armstrong mentioned earlier, because some of our adjustments that we're recommending in the budget for this year are one-time in nature, they don't carry forward to next year, not automatically. And so what that means is that we will, unless the revenues, and we all hope they do, come back to more historic growth levels, and even if they come back to sort of average levels, we're still going to have a bit of a hole to plug in 2010.
It might be good for you to explain the bottom three columns there on required policy reserves, because I think there's a widespread misunderstanding of what that really means.
Certainly. The policy reserves, as established by the City Council back in 1997 by resolution, established that we would have about 25% of the operating budget in reserves, and in addition a $1 million capital reserve. And the fact of the matter is that at the current time we have about 20% of our operating budget in reserves. We have broken those into 2 reserves. The sort of more sacrosanct of them is our disaster reserve, which is 15% of the operating budget. And in my entire tenure here, since that policy was established in 97, no city council has taken any money out of the disaster reserve, despite the fact that there have been a number of declared disasters both before and after. So that reserve is and remains fully funded at 15%. One of the quirks of the way our policy works, our reserve policy, is because it's stated as a percentage of the budget. As the budget goes up, so does the policy reserve, and so the fact of the matter is that even though our total reserves may be increasing or at least stable, we seem to be falling further behind, and we have talked about coming back to the Finance Committee and ultimately to the full Council to revisit our reserve policy. I mean, it's been well over a decade, 11 years, and I think it's appropriate that once every 10 or 11 years that those kinds of financial policies be revisited.
The fact of the matter is that if no budget adjustments of any kind were made, but that people were given a COLA or cost of living adjustment only on a budget our size, the reserve requirements would still go up.
That's correct.
Even with respect to no other adjustments in the budget,
That's
they would still rise related to the COLA on salaries.
Right.
Can I mention about the budget policy? As you mentioned, I was thinking it's been 11 years, and I know this is my 3rd year on finance, and we've talked about each year the capital reserve of $1 million, and that stays constant because it's not a percentage. The other thing that's happened, and we've talked about in the Finance Committee, of whether it makes sense to keep $1 million there or to reallocate it back into the budget reserve or somewhere else, because the value of $1 million 11 years ago was much more than the value of that same $1 million today, because the cost of capital goes up. At the same time, in the last decade, the way the budget's been put together, and I've seen it in my 5 years here, or 4.5 or whatever, is pieces of the budget that weren't there before a decade ago. For example, a capital line item for Americans with Disabilities Act adjustments, or a capital line item for sustainability adjustments. So things that probably go well beyond $1 million if you put them all together. We're just incorporating that into the budget instead of deferred maintenance type as a reserve. So there's more and more reasons to me why that capital reserve is just really $1 million sitting in the bank and not really getting value for it, or part of the, or acknowledging that it should be part of our budget reserve at the very least, and moving that from, for example, in the FY09 recommendation from 11 million.1 to 12 million.1. So there's just a lot of reasons behind that. I know we keep talking about it, but I want to bring that up again. And it also, when we finally get to looking at the policy in general, I think we're pretty unique as a city to have a 25% overall reserve divided up between budget and capital, and it would be good to see what other cities of our scope do if they have a policy, and then what's actually in that money. I mean, they might have the policy, but do they actually even come close to acknowledging that or not? That would be important information to have.
I know we're almost out of time, but I want to just follow up on that quickly. Unfortunately, there is no scientifically compiled statewide data on reserves of cities. The last such study that I'm aware of was probably 15 years ago. I do have anecdotal evidence, surveys that have been done, voluntary type surveys on listservs and the like, and we certainly have that information. The other thing I want to point out is that, you know, in the last 6 years or so, we have as a city made great strides in funding specific reserves that are outside the general fund, and I'll mention just two. One is a vehicle replacement reserve. 6 years ago, we had no money in the bank to replace vehicles, and whatever we budgeted that year to replace vehicles, we spent it that year, and that was it. Now we have a fully depreciated, fully funded depreciation on all of our city rolling stock, including vehicles and equipment. That's something that we didn't have before, and that's a whole other dimension that in the past we would have had to rely on general fund reserves to fund those kinds of unforeseen events like a front-end loader breaking down or a bucket truck dying. We don't have to do that anymore because we've got money accumulated in our vehicle replacement fund outside the general fund. The risk management reserve 5 or 6 years ago, I'm a little bit embarrassed to say, was underfunded to the tune of maybe 30 or 40% in terms of what we should have in the bank from actuarially determined risk management reserves. We are now, as we've told you, and based on some recommendations in this budget, we now have more money in the reserves than the actuaries say we have to. So we've made great strides in that, and I think that's another reason why it's warranted to revisit our general fund reserve policy, because we simply don't have to rely on those general fund reserves for all the myriad of things that 6 or 7 years ago we did.
We have another question. I just comment that when we get through this budget cycle, perhaps one of your earliest meetings you can schedule this discussion of the reserve policy for us.
We'd be glad to.
I'd be more than happy to have that conversation. The other side of the coin is, though, as Ms. Schneider correctly pointed out, the value of money today gets you less than the value of money did 6.5 years ago when I got here. We didn't have street sweepers, for instance. That's another item that, but looking at it is never a bad thing. Changing it, we'll see. In this $2,287,000 in the net decrease that you mentioned for the FY10, you were talking about us proposing a balanced budget today for 09, but in 10 you pointed out that there's a negative of 2.2 or 2.3. Again, doesn't that correlate, maybe not exactly, but it certainly has some influence with regard to the fact that your estimated growth numbers for the various different revenue streams of sales tax, TOT, and property tax have gone down considerably looking toward the future? Just for 09, as you pointed out, sales tax was budgeted at 3.5. It's now estimated at 1%. TOT at 5. It's now being estimated at 3. Doesn't that go directly into the forecast of these numbers?
Mr. Armstrong or Mr. Pearson?
Yes. Yes, indeed it does. I would point out that for the next 2-year plan in this model, 10 and 11, we have assumed a return to our traditional 4% a year revenue growth. But having said that, if 09 returns to that growth so that we return to that growth more quickly than we had anticipated, then absolutely that will have that rollover impact I was just talking about into 2010 by raising the base. Right. But I think it is important to point out that both 10 and 11, we have assumed a return to our standard 4% a year revenue growth assumption.
For the non-departmentals, for the departmentals, and when you get down to the total departmental revenues, you've got a negative 1.2.
Excuse me, that is because of certain one-time measures that you'll see at the bottom of that, like the street sweeping reserves, $500,000, and if you look up the workers' comp rebate.
Okay, so that directly correlates to some of these adjustments that you're suggesting right now.
Correct.
Okay,
Part
good.
of
Well,
that
that's very important to know.
is because we're making one-time adjustments this year, which are not carried forward in the mathematical projections, but they could be carried
But they
forward
could
if
be.
we have to. And to your point, if the revenues do respond, then we won't have to do that. But if they don't respond, then we will have to continue those. cut
And
forward.
I think it's really important when you look at this, this is a multi-year forecast,
Right.
and you're considering the 2009 budget. 2010 and 2011, those are just projections. If nothing changes, this is where we would be. We have no intention of submitting to you a budget next year that will use $2.2 million of reserves. We will bring you a balanced budget. Now, you may say, no, we want to use reserves, but we'll bring you a balanced budget. And what we're saying, though, is based upon what we know now, we're not sure where those adjustments would be. If revenues go up by 2%, we won't need to make those adjustments. But if they go down by 2%, the adjustments will be more. But we thought it was important to identify for you basically what we think the scope of the problem is. But one of the problems when you look at this planning document is people look and they go, oh, they're going to use another $4 million worth of reserves in the next 2 years. And we really aren't planning to do that. We're just telling you this is kind of what the scope of the issue we're going to have to deal with is.
It could be, all things
Yeah.
being equal. However, it ain't necessarily so. And we'll deal with that, down the road when we know more things more certainly.
Exactly.
So just that being said, and also the business about the reserves growing. Last year in '08, it was $27.5 million. This year, it's projected $28.5 million. In 10, it's projected 29, almost $30 million. So, as Mr. Horton correctly pointed out, I mean, the budget at one point in 2001 was under $200,000. It was under $200 million. It was like $197 million. It's now projected in total, with all the enterprise funds and everything added in, somewhere in the neighborhood of 250. So this is a fluid set of numbers, and I think it needs to be read that way and understood that way. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Mr. Pearson, anything else for the meeting today?
No, thank you for your.
If not, then we'll adjourn today's Finance Committee meeting. Thanks, everybody, for watching.